Hi everyone, welcome to Parade. My name is Robert and I'm very excited because this is going to be our first video that we're releasing in English. As some of you may have heard from my accent, I'm American. German is not my first language. I do speak it fluently. I'm not perfect, although I speak German at work. I'm involved in clubs, all German speaking, so it's a lot easier for me to put out content in English. Although I do like doing German content, of course, as well. Learning German was probably one of the most difficult things that I ever did in my life, but it's really worth it. It's opened my eyes up to the wonderful culture here, opened my eyes up to just what it's like to know more than one language. It unlocks so many wonderful things in life. Today, I want to talk a little bit about my background, how I got to where I am today. One of our first videos was how Martin and I met, how I got to Germany, kind of how our life started here, our marriage, our journey to parenthood. So I do want to touch on some of those things. This video will probably be a little bit more geared towards just sort of like my journey, what it's like to move to another country, to move to Germany, what obstacles I faced, kind of how I did it, how I got a job, how I learned the language, all of that. So I would just want to offer, if anyone is interested to know how they can move to Germany, what it's like being an expat here, how do you sign up for a language course, how do you get a job here, all these sort of things. Please do let me know in the comments. If you're interested in more English language content as well, would be happy to know. If there's any way that I can be a resource to you all, I'm really happy to always share my stories, my perspective, my knowledge, any tips and tricks that I have. So please do let me know. First, I want to start off just a little bit with my background so you all can get to know me a little bit better. And it is kind of an exciting opportunity for me to even do this video because speaking my own language, I can just really speak from like my mind and my heart. I don't have to overthink everything. I don't have to memorize as much. I mean, when I'm doing German language content, I'm really doing a lot of prepping, a lot of practicing, getting involved, having to do sometimes multiple takes or struggling through it, or in the moment when I'm taping something, I'm finding it really hard to like find the words and think about grammar and what I'm saying, and am I having people understand what I'm saying, that sort of thing. So it's an exciting opportunity now to just talk a bit more freely and at like kind of a more high level. If you are also watching our German language content, but founding Paparata has just been a really fun experience. It's been a great challenge for me. We're really putting ourselves out there. I'm putting myself out there, definitely, doing the content in German. So it's been a great learning experience for me, but it's difficult, and I really do try my best. I hope that if you are also watching our German language content, that you also see that as well. Hopefully it's interesting for you all. And yeah, of course, like I make a few mistakes here and there with the language, but not so bad, I hope. So anyways, I grew up in the US and I do have heritage, European heritage, Scottish, German, and Polish to be specific. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's a big city more towards the south. If you're not familiar with the US so much, maybe you've heard of Florida. It's the state above Florida. We also went to Florida a lot on vacations when I was growing up. And I do also still have some family there. So growing up in Atlanta was great for me as a kid because it's quite a big city. Atlanta is known for having the 1996 Olympics. Coca-Cola is headquartered there. It really is a big metropolitan city, very, very spread out. So it did offer a lot of opportunities for me as a child. I specifically was very into theater. So I grew up going to all different kinds of theater productions, theater camps, that sort of thing. And I actually, when I went to college in New York City. I studied theater management and producing, and I minored in business management. But when I was growing up, I essentially wanted to be a Broadway producer. And I started that journey when I was 18. I moved to New York City. I went to university there. It was quite a very different university experience compared to most people. First of all, I was 18, just kind of dumped in the city. I was suddenly on my own, no parents. And it was truly such a wild, great time. But I think it was not so typical because we didn't have a typical campus. Our freshman dorm, for instance, was a 32-story building with 550 freshmen. So if you can imagine in college having all of your friends living in the same building, and not only that, we were all just an elevator ride away, which is just crazy. I had friends that went to really big campus schools, and they maybe had to walk like 20 minutes just to get from one building to the other or to go visit their friends or whatever. We were really all in one high rise building. So that's definitely a very unique experience at my college. And then we did have a campus on the Upper East Side, which is about a 20-minute walk away from the dorm building. But kind of everything was also contained like in that one campus building. But otherwise, New York City was my campus. I had the whole city, before me. Being in theater, I did all kinds of internships, part-time jobs. I was doing some jobs on Broadway. I was also working in film production. I did background extra work, was a stand-in. I also started doing that a bit in Atlanta. So I kind of used like any free time that I had, whether it was summer or winter breaks. If there were times where maybe I only had classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then maybe Tuesdays and Thursdays, I could do some extra work. But I've worked on probably over 50 TV shows and movies as a background extra. Sometimes I'm probably not seen at all. Sometimes, like, if you blink, you miss me. And then in some of the shows, you can see me quite well, which is exciting. And with the show that I worked on the most was called The Vampire Diaries, which is on CW. Um, Came out, I guess, in 2009, ran quite a while. You can definitely find it on Netflix now. I'm kind of all over the first two seasons, being like a student and working at the Mystic Grill and just being in the community on that show. So that's the show I worked on the most. That was a really fun time in my life. But my life, I always thought was going to be me working in theater or maybe working in film. I don't know, but having studied theater production and management, I did several internships, with like producing and management. I then eventually got a job at a small off-Broadway theater in New York City, and I did really all kinds of different jobs there. I first started as an intern, then I went to part-time, then full-time, then got promoted. Um, and just really took on so many different roles and responsibilities at that theater, which was great because at that theater, even though we were quite small and a not-for-profit theater, we actually were working with pretty much all of Broadway's biggest names that you can imagine, because the theater specialized in preserving old musicals, also bringing new musicals to life and giving them a platform. There were just so many different patrons, producers, actors, designers, whoever, that really, really had that theater in the heart. And even though they weren't making a lot of money working on those shows, like I said, we really had like the highest caliber of people often working on those shows. I mean, we also had a lot of unknown people at sometimes. We did so many different types of productions there. It was kind of all over the place. But yeah, essentially what I want to say by that is, working at that theater, I mean, I basically worked with so many of my teenage heroes in the theater, some of my favorite actors and actresses. I really have so many crazy stories working in the industry. But all of that kind of changed, and I was kind of uprooted from all of that basically when I fell in love with Martin, so my now husband. So how that happened is I was still in university. I did have enough credits to graduate a semester early. So because actually when I was proposed to graduate in 2013, at that time in the US, that was the biggest graduating class that had ever existed in the US. So I thought, well, I do have the credits. I can actually save some money by not doing another semester. And maybe I'll just put myself out there ever so slightly before everyone else is looking for jobs. So I went to university for 3.5 years instead of four. And I did pretty much get a full-time job more or less right after. I did graduate early. I mean, I started graduation a bit later, but I was already starting to work, which is when I had my theater job. Before I started working, I had a summer before me, and I knew that I would be graduating early. And I said, I always wanted to do a European backpacking trip. It was kind of always on my bucket list. I had traveled really throughout my whole life. Interesting fact about me is that my great grandmother actually was one of the first female pilots ever in the US, which is really cool. She started kind of an association in St. Louis where she grew up, and St. Louis is quite known for airplanes. And she was also known for, she would fly troops like all around the world. She did a lot of volunteering, like flying people if they needed it. She went to really crazy places, like she went to hang out with the mud dancers in Papua New Guinea. She traveled all over the world and kind of brought back all kinds of like artifacts and souvenirs and that kind of thing. So I always grew up knowing like, wow, my great grandmother has, this explorer kind of travel gene in her, and that was really passed down to like my grandmother, my mother, and so forth. So as maybe not being such a typical American, because I heard that only what's the statistic, like 25% of Americans have a passport, 75% of Americans don't. So being a passport holder is already kind of like unique and unusual. But I traveled a lot as a kid. I went to Europe the first time when I was 11 years old, maybe even early, actually, I think 11. I went to Italy the year before, was the UK, France, and Switzerland, went all over the Caribbean, just traveled all over the US. I had family kind of everywhere, but travel was always very, very important to me. I was lucky at a young age to kind of be introduced to different cultures, different languages, different ways of life, seeing how life was different for other people compared to my life back home. And that just instilled really so much in me as a child and just opened my perspective, broadened my horizons. I would say really made me into the person that I am today. And kind of knowing that and having traveled through Europe quite extensively, also the way that my mother and I would usually travel together, and we kind of roughed it a little bit. Like we would stay in youth hostels. We didn't want to like really spend too much money on accommodation because, as like with most European travels, you're kind of gone the whole day. You're walking so much. You're doing all kinds of side trips. So we just kind of stayed in like a hostel, private room together. I mean, I was like kind of too young to stay in a dormitory by myself, but we just met so many people on our travels. I remember even, yeah, traveling a bit in Central America, Costa Rica, and Panama, also doing the same. Whether it was meeting my older people that were also traveling, had traveled their whole lives, or really young people traveling for the first time. But that just for me was really normal to just meet travelers and stay in youth hostels and that kind of thing. So I already said at a young age, like, oh, I'm definitely going to do that when I'm in university, when I have the time to travel for a couple months. I think as cliche as it sounds, I think every American wants to do some kind of European backpack trip. I did make it happen. I booked a 2-month trip. I was with one friend the entire time, and then along the way, I like my best friend, she was living in Paris at the time, but then she was traveling that summer, met up with us quite a bunch. I had a couple American friends that were also traveling that we met up with. But actually, what was really exciting is that through the trip, meeting people, like we would meet someone in one city and they'd say, oh, you have to come stay with us when you come to where we live. So we did that. We just met a lot of people on the way. So I booked a trip to Dublin, basically just like booked the cheapest one-way ticket I could find. And on the way back, the last stop was Budapest, but I flew back via the Ukraine. So that was also like the cheapest ticket I could find. I had one night in Ukraine, which was at the time the furthest east I had ever been, which is really exciting. So I kind of had, you know, I had where I was flying to, where I was coming back from, but everything in between was spontaneous. So I had one of those train passes. I think I had like 15 days of travel that I could use. And my friend and I, yeah, we just kind of planned every city that we went to only like 1 or 2 days before. We were listening to recommendations of what people gave us along our journey. So now kind of getting into the story how I met Martin. So I was in London at the time. And yeah, it's kind of a weird, funny story, but back then, Instagram was basically brand new. This was 2012. I had only just had it a few months after our friend told me to download it. A friend that was visiting New York, he posted a picture of us at the High Line in New York. He back then was actually quite well known on Lookbook. I don't know if anyone remembers Lookbook, but that was like one of those kind of influencer social media type things that had only just started back then, before all that other kind of influencer stuff took off. He was quite known on Lookbook and I guess had some international followers as well. So he posted this photo of us at the High Line in New York. And Martin, also following him, saw the photo. But this was still a few months before I went on my backpacking trip. But then fast forward to when I was in London, I posted a photo of myself on the trip. My friend, who we're talking about, he liked my photo. And then I guess through Explore, Martin saw that photo on Instagram, recognized me from the photo before. I guess he also thought I was like interesting or attractive or whatever. Wanted to know more, went to my profile, saw I was traveling Europe, and he decided to write me. So I got a message from this guy from Munich, and of course, with any first encounter, it's a bit like, okay, who is this person? What do they want? But because I was traveling, because I was meeting so many new people, because I was open to new experiences, it wasn't that strange to kind of converse with a stranger more or less. So we just began corresponding a little bit on Instagram. He was asking where I was traveling, what I was doing, what I was up to, asked if I was coming to Munich, where he lived at the time. And it was so funny because actually, right before then, I met someone from Hamburg, Germany. I was kind of telling them, like, oh, I've never been to Germany. I really want to travel there. I have family heritage, would love to go. He's from Hamburg, which is in the north. And he was like, oh, don't go to Munich in the south. Like, it's so horrible. The people there are bad or like whatever. There's kind of like a north and south rivalry, like in many countries. But I still wanted to go. I absolutely wanted to go to Munich. There was no reason, even if some random guy told me not to. I was like, I'm definitely going. So at that time, like I still had a lot of travel before me before I was going to make it to southern Germany. But yeah, I told Martin, I said, yeah, I'm definitely coming and I'll be there in about a month. Let's meet up. And he had worked before as a tour guide. So he knows so much about Munich, about the city, about the history. So he said, like, I'm going to give you a tour, and we planned everything. Yeah, the day that we met outside of the hotel that we were staying at. I had never believed in something like this before, or at least like never imagined that something like that would happen to me or could happen to me. But it was definitely love at first sight, as cheesy as it sounds. But we just kind of locked eyes, and the rest is history. I don't know. There was just something about his look that he gave me, his aura, his spirit, his kindness. Then he showed us around Munich, and he's just so knowledgeable, so passionate, really about history, about Munich. He really knows more than anyone I've ever met about Munich. So we just had an absolutely amazing summer day in the city, and we were only supposed to stay 2 days at first. We ended up extending it to 3, did some side trips as well. Even though I had this love at first sight moment, nothing actually happened on the trip. I was under the impression that he was in a relationship. So I essentially, left Munich. I went on to Prague with my friends and kind of left with a broken heart, I must say, or, all these kind of questions of like, oh, what if I did say that I liked him, or what if I did live here, or, I don't know. But I always had a lot of those situations in my life already, having like grown up in Atlanta and living in New York. I was never like someone that really dated a lot, especially in high school. Like I went to a very conservative religious high school. You were not allowed to be a gay man, with the risk of like actually being kicked out of school, unfortunately. So my relationship life and my self-discovery and my acceptance of like coming out and being out as a gay man and dating and feeling comfortable with that, like that was a bit later than I guess a lot of like people dating in high school and that sort of thing. I always would have instances like where I was studying in New York, and maybe I met someone back home, but I was like, well, I live in New York, we can't be together. Or, just also like traveling, meeting people and just saying, well, I don't want to do long distance, or it's just, not going to work out. But so kind of left with a broken heart thinking like all these what ifs, like what could be. I basically just fell in love with someone and maybe I will never see them again. I don't know. I mean, we definitely said like we stay in contact. Yeah, I left. I was in Prague. Actually, then my best friend, who I mentioned earlier, she met us there, and we had like like on our first night we were sitting at like a bar, and I was basically telling them this whole story. I'll never forget it. In that moment I literally get a message from Martin on Facebook Messenger, a super long message, and he just poured out his heart and soul to me and was basically saying all the things that I was saying in the moment, all the things that I was thinking, kind of going back in different moments that we had over the 3 days where we spent time together in Munich. Yeah, it was just so crazy because it was just like a confirmation from the universe that, it wasn't only just love at first sight, that like maybe somehow we were actually soulmates. I don't know. So that on the one hand was definitely surprising because, like I said, I was basically like crying over a drink in Prague, and then the next moment, suddenly everything changed, which was super exciting. And so then just a few days later, I was like flying back to the Ukraine. I remember actually like FaceTiming him when I was at the airport in Ukraine because I was like a bit nervous because my friend who I traveled with the whole time, he went on to Poland. I was flying back to New York via Ukraine and was suddenly like by myself after 2 months. There, like, definitely had problems with English and that sort of thing. So it was just nice to like suddenly have contact with someone and kind of tell them what was going on. And then I flew back to New York. I moved into a new apartment, kind of was getting settled back in, ready to have my last semester of university and then get ready for the whole job application process. But we decided after about a month's time, so this was still in the summer, that we wanted to make it official. We wanted to start dating, but it would unfortunately be a long distance relationship. And not only just any kind of long distance, it was, over the Atlantic Ocean, he being in Munich in Germany, me being in New York in the US. I didn't question it at all. Like I just immediately said like yes, like I want to be in a relationship with you. But I didn't in the moment think about like all the repercussions that would come along with being in a long distance relationship. Like I knew, okay, I'm getting into something pretty intense and pretty difficult, and something that probably most people would not find sustainable or have it last, unfortunately. I mean, I did, even like in university, had a lot of friends that had boyfriends and girlfriends back home and just, a couple hours. I knew that that was already difficult enough, but, I said, like, I really trusted and I just had such strong feelings, and just somehow we matched so perfectly that I said, like, I'm gonna do it. And even if it doesn't work out, like I want to try. I want to try. I don't want to lose him. So we started a long distance relationship. What really, really made it work so well is that for the first year, I'm not exaggerating. I think there was only one time, like one day, where we didn't have some kind of like video call. So we would always FaceTime each other, even if it was like for 5 minutes. I mean, it was sometimes quite long. Like we had many times where we talked for like 4 hours, I would say, but maybe usual was maybe just like 30 minutes every day. But even if that wasn't possible, it was just for like a few minutes before one of us went to bed, just to check in, just to say hello, just to have some kind of like visual chat with the other person. I mean, we were then otherwise, of course, like texting the whole day. What was difficult with that, I mean, thank goodness for technology, that we even had that opportunity. I think back to people that just had to write letters or, just use the regular phone for long distance. But the thing that was actually more difficult than the distance was the time change. So it was a 6 hour difference. But the thing is like I was working in theater. So I was working nights, weekends, holidays. So my schedule was like very different. It was not a typical like 9 to 5 kind of schedule, whereas he had that typical like kind of office working schedule, but being ahead. But the problem is because I was like more working late at night, would then accordingly like sleep in the next day because I didn't need to be at work until maybe noon sometimes, or even 6 p.m. on days like where we had shows. So basically, he was waking up, he was going through his whole day, he was at work, and then I would wake up at like 10 a.m. New York time. That would be 4 p.m. his time. So he basically, woke up, had an entire full day at work, and wasn't until like 4 p.m. when he was maybe already starting to wrap up his workday a bit that I would send the first text like good morning. So for Martin, he had it a lot harder because he had a much smaller window where I was even awake and where we could talk. There were maybe some instances, like because I was working later, that he could then he would have to go to sleep. I would still go about then my whole day with not being able to speak to him. But then there were some times, luckily, where then he would wake up and I would also still be awake. with the time change. So there were also like some times where we could squeeze in some calls here and there. You know, he unfortunately did have like the worst end of the stick, so to speak, because then, you know, then when he went to bed, then I was then super involved with like the rest of my day. You know, I was going to work, I was doing things socially after work. You know, I definitely didn't take that for granted by any means, but after a while, we just realized, you know, the situation is not ideal. It is what it is. Like, we still want to do long distance. So, you know, we did it for 3 years. It was, yeah, definitely a difficult experience, but we made the best of it. Like I said, just all of the little things that we did, like FaceTiming every day was super important. But not only that, next point would be is we made sort of a pledge to see each other every 3 months in person. So luckily that was able to happen more because of Martin, because he working in Europe, he I think had 30 holidays at his job. I had something more like 3 weeks, maybe like 15, 18 days. I can't remember exactly, but he had then therefore the opportunity to travel a bit more to the US just because he had more vacation days. And as I mentioned, like I was working in theater. Sometimes I was working 6 days a week because we had shows. Monday being my only off day, so I was working on weekends. So even when I was able to take time off, I always had a plan around the theater schedule. And not only that, Martin actually does have an American family, which I might have to talk about in a different video. So he had also other reasons for wanting to come. Like sometimes he would combine the trips, see some of his family, come see me. He would also travel sometimes for work. He a few times went to the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas, and would stop by. You know, we also did a trip to Atlanta to visit my family and that sort of thing. Then there were times like where then I was able to come to Germany. So when I did graduate early from college, you know, I was done with my studies at the end of that December. So then was going to the phase of like, okay, you know, well, I had a few like kind of part-time jobs, but what, you know, I didn't have a full-time job after college, which I was applying for. So I was a bit more flexible. So what I did is in the early January, I just went to Munich for 2 weeks and stayed with Martin. And that was then the third time that we saw each other in person. So the first time is when we met in Munich. The second time was a few months later, where then he did a New York trip and came to visit me. So then the third time that we ever saw each other in person, I was there for 2 weeks. And that was super exciting just because we were really able to bond during that time. I saw even more of like Munich and Bavaria and other parts of Germany, and just really, really fell in love with Munich. I was then determined one day to live there. Absolutely, anyways, wanted to always live in a different country. I mean, had it have not been Germany, like already on my travels before I even met Martin, you know, it'd be somewhere like, I don't know, Barcelona. I was like, oh, I love it here. I like, you know, even if it's for 1 year, I want to move here. Then I would go somewhere else. Like, oh, Amsterdam's amazing. Like, I could also imagine myself living here. Like, oh, Berlin, such a cool city. But yeah, Munich was then suddenly like the ultimate city for me. Has one of the highest qualities of life in the world as a city. Just has so much to offer, being so close to the mountains, being in Central Europe, basically anything that you could ever imagine wanting to do, I guess, more or less than other, like, well, I mean, yeah, not everything, of course, but you know what I mean. Munich has it. Munich has so much to offer. I mean, Munich has Oktoberfest. I also came to Oktoberfest 1 year, my first time to visit Martin. So, you know, we were seeing each other every 3 months. He was coming to the US a bit more, but still, nevertheless, we did have that time together, even if it was like 3, 5 days a week, 2 weeks, whatever. After already about 2 years, we kind of said, like, hey, where's this going? What are we doing? What is this relationship going to be? We can't do long distance forever. It's not sustainable. Is it going to go anywhere? So then, after about 2 years, started then to seriously look at options, both of us, to see, can one of us move to another country? And so I was kind of already starting to plant the seeds a little bit. Martin having some American family, he maybe thought there would be some opportunities, but unfortunately, like even with his dad being a U.S. citizen, like the wait to get a green card at the time was still 6 years. I think it's gotten a little bit better now. Even him applying for jobs, he just like never even got answers from people. Moving to the U.S. is very difficult because they just don't let in a lot of skilled workers, unfortunately. I mean, that is also, I think, why. I mean, there are a lot of other reasons, but like why people do have to resort to other ways of getting into the country is just because there like basically is no line for skilled workers to like get a visa, to like if you're doing a language study to like get a visa to come there. Like it's really really difficult, and that's even with him having an American father. So I mean, imagine people that are possibly wanting to immigrate to the U.S. and just have basically zero options, which is quite a shame because the US, like so many advanced countries, desperately need skilled workers. But unfortunately, even despite him applying for jobs, trying to make it work, it just wasn't going anywhere. But nevertheless, like I was super keen to move to Germany. I mean, like as I said, I always wanted to live in another country. So for me, it was kind of like, well, yeah, it makes sense for me to come. Martin would have loved to come to the US, but actually, he was not a fan and still isn't a fan of New York. So that would have been a bit problematic. Whereas, like on the other hand, I'm like, oh, I love Munich. I would definitely want to live there. So then I got really serious about making that happen. So I then started researching basically every opportunity there was. I at first didn't know how exactly I was going to make it happen. So I was just considering everything. So one consideration was, do I want to study again? Like, do I want to do a master's there? Maybe study something else, I don't know, but also the advantage of university being more or less free in Germany. That was certainly a possibility. Another possibility would have just been to get a job right away. So I was looking at, like at the time, mostly theater jobs, but it was, of course, like open for anything more or less. And then the third option, and the one that I actually ended up settling on, was doing intensive language school, like learning German, because as long as you're enrolled in a German language course, you can get a visa. And then, well, it depends on what country you're coming from. Luckily, like the US has some partnerships with Germany that it's ever so slightly easier if you come from certain countries. So countries, yeah, like the US, Australia, Japan, and so on, they have that option. I don't know if you're coming from other countries, if it's exactly as easy as I had it, but I think so because I mean, in my language school, I remember being in one class, we were people with over 30 different nationalities. So it's certainly possible. The only caveat, and maybe that's where other countries it's better, but the only caveat was for me on the language study visa, I was not allowed to work. So it was really just for studying. And then the idea was that I was going to do 1 year of language school and then I was going to look for a job. I was hoping to do it as fast as possible to find a job, but there was also an option that I had considered before when first moving there. But I was basically planning that when my language study visa runs out, or like before, I would then apply for what's called a job seekers visa, which then gives you 6 months to look for a job if you fulfill certain requirements. So you need to have at least a bachelor. I mean, having a bachelor already qualifies you as being like a skilled worker. Having that, having certain like financial securities to make sure that I can support myself while being there and looking for a job, and that I wasn't gonna, I don't know, like be living on the street or like suddenly seeking government assistance or something. So they just want to make sure that you can kind of sustain yourself while you're looking for a job. You have some kind of livelihood. You're a skilled worker. That eventually, you getting a job will provide a benefit. So that was like kind of the option that I had: language school, then job seeker visa, and then find a job. Still, I was really unsure about the getting the job part. So even when I was in language school, I was also applying for some master's programs. Unfortunately, like a bit too late with the deadline, some of them. But I was just keeping all options open. But so yes, I decided to go for the language school route. So I found a program. I signed up. For Americans, you didn't have to apply for the visa beforehand. I think that's also like the benefit, as I mentioned, in other countries. Probably can do the same route, but you just need to apply for the visa beforehand, get it from the consulate, and then you're able to travel. Whereas I was able to travel first, and I just had to apply shortly after getting there. So I started language school, which was a very daunting task because, as I mentioned earlier, learning German was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, if not like the most difficult. Still a challenge to this day, but I enrolled in the program and I was unsure like where my language capacity was, because I actually had started before self-teaching a little bit. So whether it was through books, I had a really, really great computer program, Rosetta Stone. I was able to, like have a little bit of conversation or at least understand some things here and there. I already did like a placement to start with like B1, which actually completely failed. So they were like, you can either start with A1 or A2. I'm like, okay, that's fine. It makes sense. But I decided to start with A2 because I thought, well, I don't want to start like all the way from the beginning because each course was essentially 2 months. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to start with A1, which ended up being like the right decision, I guess, in retrospect, because of the way that everything kind of played out. I don't regret that at all. But I must say that basically, like the first 2 weeks, the first month, the first two months, even like I was almost having a meltdown every day just because of like how difficult the course was for me, kind of coming in. Yes, I had some knowledge. Like I said, being self-taught, but it was like the first time being in a classroom setting, learning German, the first time basically speaking with other people and not just speaking with a computer program. And not only that, because a lot of other people had already done the A1 course before me, so they had already been living in Germany and practicing for 2 months, where basically I had like just moved and was just starting fresh. So for the first like 2 weeks, I was questioning so much, like, can I get through this? Did I make the right decision? Am I gonna like fail my course? Because the problem was, after every major course, there was a test. And if you didn't pass a test, then you weren't allowed to go on to the next course, which then meant repeating. And so I was like, well, I don't have the time to repeat. I'm not working while I'm in Germany. I'm not allowed to work. So I don't want to then repeat a course for 2 months because that's just more time that I'm not able to work and earn money. So I had so much pressure, like studying, just being having so much like stress and anxiety about passing the course and taking the test and everything. Luckily, I did just pass like every time, so didn't have to repeat any courses. But on the other hand, like I was just for, I mean, I think I only ended up doing 10 months in the end of my course, but I had the language visa for 1 year. I did it all the way through C1.2, which gave me the ability, like when I got that certificate, I got a certificate that basically allows you to study in German at German universities. So I was like more or less fluent at the end. Of course, like there's still a big gap between like being fluent and having a language be your mother tongue, but still, I went through the courses. But I just had that time to learn German. I wasn't working, so I was able to do the homework. I was able to study. But on the other hand, like I have so much respect for anyone learning a language, because especially people who have to work full time, or study or learn the language at the same time. I mean, it's a big commitment. I mean, I was in class 3.5 hours a day, so I could not imagine some people, if they were doing evening courses, like working a full day, 8 hours, and then doing hours of German course at night or on the weekends or whatever. That's hard. It's super hard. And then if you have a family, with all these kind of other obligations, which I didn't at the time, it's super hard. So please don't judge anyone learning a language, because as I mentioned, like it is a big time requirement. It's also a financial requirement. That being said, like I had that time. I learned German super, super fast. If you want to know anything more about like my journey to find a language course, anything about getting the visa applications, all of that, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to maybe do a separate video, or I can also just give you some like one-on-one consultation. Happy to do that and share my experience. But during that time, I did have quite a lot of free time because, like I said, I wasn't working. I was doing a lot of studying. So I was just trying to do as much as I could. I actually started a blog back then, which I wish I had kept up with more. Just was trying to like meet new friends, meet new circles. That being said, like I moved there to be with Martin, after 3 years of long distance. I had a lot of people ask me, like, well, with the visa situation, like, couldn't you, I don't know, have just gotten married and made that so much easier, and then not have to worry about like the stress of getting a visa or finding a job? Or I moved there to be with Martin. Like I wanted to move there for love, for my relationship, to see, will we work? Like, we did 3 years of long distance, but what would it be like to actually like be together and live together? And yeah, I actually was like moving in with him. He found a new apartment. He moved in like just right before I moved, but we really went out on a limb and said, okay, like we're going to move in together. And suddenly have like our own life starting then. So I definitely like moved there to have our relationship work. But on the other hand, and I mean, this is what I told a lot of other people because I felt this was actually maybe a bit of a stronger reason. I wanted to move there actually for myself. And what I mean by that is because especially like I was going out on a limb. I really loved Martin after 3 years. There was no doubt in my mind that I didn't want to be with him, but there was still the possibility that maybe when we live together or then have like more of like an average day-to-day kind of life, like maybe it unfortunately doesn't work out, that maybe it only somehow worked because we were doing long distance. Maybe it only worked because we were doing long distance, or we had like kind of our daily talks, but then we went on about the rest of our lives. So I did have to kind of think about the possibility that maybe it won't work out, or maybe when we live together we just find out that we don't actually match with each other, or I don't know, there's like the one random thing that we can't stand about the other person, or like whatever, I don't know. But I had to consider that. Definitely, it was definitely a reality, a possibility. That being said, like so I had my own reason. Like I always wanted to live in another country. I had fallen in love with Munich. I was ready to learn the language. So the idea was, if unfortunately we broke up, our relationship didn't work out, that I would still kind of have like all my own reasons for wanting to stay and be there. So I felt like that was quite of a strong reason, because it was really like, okay, I have like these reasons for wanting to move to Germany. It's not just because of another person, like it's also because of me. And I felt like that was a bit of a stronger reason. But I don't know. I had a lot of friends, especially from the US, kind of say like, no, just say you're moving for love. Like, just yeah, just say like you're moving there, for your boyfriend or whatever. And like, yes, like I get that. Like that actually, of course, was the reason. But like I said, I had my own reasons for wanting to move, and I had to take into consideration that maybe for whatever reason the relationship wouldn't work out. And I mean, I would have liked to think that if that actually had unfortunately been the case, that I would have stayed and I would have kept trying, and I wouldn't have just like immediately moved back to the US. I don't know. Yeah, I basically, moving back a little bit to talk now a little bit about the moving process. I quit my job in New York. I basically gave up my theater career, more or less. Like I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I can maybe talk about that later. But I mean, it's sad that I don't have the theater community around me anymore, because the New York theater community is very, very special and very close and something very, very unique. But that being said, I was like very burnt out in my job. I did stick around in where I was working at the time, because I kind of knew, okay, I'm going to be moving. So had that not been the case, I maybe would have like changed my job or changed my situation a little bit. But I was unfortunately a little bit burnt out working in show business, and it is unfortunately in theater not very well paid. You work a lot of crazy